All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And it's been said that the Falcons may have one of the better secondaries in the NFL. And on today's episode, we'll be talking about whether their young safety duo of Jaylinn Hawkins and Richie Grant help or hurt them in that distinction.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans. And of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast here on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms Monday through Friday, whether that's Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course, you can find us on YouTube as well. And if you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, give us a like, hit that bell. You will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So, jumping into today's episode, we kind of touched upon yesterday's episode on the various ways that Dean Pease will implement 100% of his defensive playbook after earlier this offseason claiming that he had only installed roughly 60% of it this past year. And in passing, we've talked about how on that episode, people have been making claims about how the Falcons may have one of the top secondaries in the NFL. And I pushed back a little bit on that. And basically, I'm like, when we talk about the corners, I think, yes, you can certainly make the case that the Falcons have one of the top zone trios in the league in Casey Hayward, AJ Terrell, and Isaiah Oliver. But the safeties kind of remain a question mark with two new starters there. And one of the things that you've heard me talk about a number of times in the past on this podcast is that it's very rare to find one of the better defenses in the NFL that doesn't also have high quality safety plays. Not necessarily a direct causation, but certainly there's a very high correlation there. And so if we're hoping for this Falcons defense under year 2 of Dean Pease to progress, we're hoping for significant growth from this duo of young safeties in Jaylinn Hawkins and Richie Grant. Dean Pease has been talking up these guys at various points throughout the offseason, as well as others. I'm on record from last year saying that Eric Harris, the incumbent starter that the Falcons re-signed, was underrated in 2021. I won't sit here and go out and tell you that he was great in 2021. Probably was roughly league average starter at that safety position, reflected in his 59 Pro Football Focus grade. But I think where he was underrated in regards to was how he sort of embodied that do your job mantra that is preached by Dean Pease constantly. Now, does he always do that job at a high level? No, but like you're still getting competency there with the versatility that he showed. And what you're kind of hoping for this group this upcoming season is that you get a similar level of competency in addition to the versatility that Harris showed. And you're hoping to see more of that this upcoming season. And I think certainly there is a high degree of potential with this young duo in Jaylinn Hawkins and Richie Grant, but I wouldn't get too optimistic given that their starting point is kind of low. Again, there's a lot of potential, but I think when you're talking about that potential, you're looking more at where they could be a couple of years from now than necessarily where they're going to be in 2022. And again, I think in part of that, the reason why I say that is I think their starting point, looking back at their 2021 seasons, was not that impressive. And we'll get into exactly where that is as we continue today's episode. But the analogy that I would use is kind of using the floor ceiling metaphors that we've used constantly when evaluating players on this, but let's just imagine like the safety play represents some, 50-story building or whatever. In the case, if you're at the top floor, you're the best safety group in the league and you're really helping your defense and team win football games. And, I think this group has, with Grant and Hawkins, have the potential to maybe get to the 35th floor or something like that. But like they're kind of starting out on the fifth floor, and so you're not expecting them to go from floor 5 to floor 35 in 1 year. By the end of the season, you're kind of more hoping they can make a floor 5 to floor 15 or a floor 5 to floor 20 jump this upcoming season, and then in subsequent years can start to make that jump up to the 35th floor or whatever the case may be. And so that to me is kind of what's at stake for this upcoming season for these guys, to sort of see how big a jump they make in year 2, if they make any jump at all. And then that will be a key part of their evaluations moving forward, rather than expecting them to deliver on all the potential that you hope and dream those guys to have. But, we'll talk about, when we're talking about the guys in terms of their low starting points from 2021, we'll talk about the guy that had probably a few more highlights from 2021 in Jaylinn Hawkins before we turn the conversation to Richie Grant, and we'll get into Jaylinn Hawkins as we continue today's Locked On Falcons episode, guys. But before we get there, I want to let you know about the ultimate NBA mock draft, which starts up on the Locked On Podcast Network this week on Thursday, June 16th. You're going to have over 50 insiders from the various Locked On shows, as well as big board draft experts, Odyssey insiders. So check out the first pick on June 16th by searching Ultimate NBA Mock Draft and follow on your preferred podcast platform so you do not miss a pick. And guys, I want to tell you about the jewelry experts at Blue Nile. Whether you're looking to pop that question or you're just looking for a nice bracelet or another piece of fine jewelry for your special someone, the experts at BlueNile.com have you covered. Whether it's the simple online tools that help you choose the shape, size, and clarity and style for your one-of-a-kind perfect engagement ring for that special someone, or you're having trouble choosing exactly what you're looking for, you have the experts on hand 24/7 via phone, via chat, to help you find that memorable gift that fits everyone's budget. You can find it all at Blue Nile. So make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. And Locked On listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. This podcast exclusive includes engagement. Just use the promo code Locked On. That's code Locked On, LOCKEDON. And with every order, it's insured, it ships free, and it also arrives in a discreet package so that you won't give away what's inside. So shop stress free and find your forever piece by going to BlueNile.com. So, talking about the expectations for Jaylinn Hawkins, he's interesting player because early on in the year, you started to see some of these flashes when he was being used as that third safety following, Isaiah Oliver's season-ending knee injury, and the Falcons didn't have as much faith in their nickel cornerback and their young nickel cornerbacks, which included Richie Grant, and they played a lot more big nickel over that week 5. Oliver got hurt in week 4, and then from like week 5 to week 9, they played a lot more big nickel with Eric Harris filling in the majority of the reps in the nickel slot. Going back to my earlier commentary about doing a job, that's a testament to Eric Harris showing that versatility to play some of that nickel during that span. He wasn't necessarily good in that role, but again, he got the Falcons through that period of time. And so, playing more of that big nickel, we got to see a lot more of Jaylinn Hawkins. Then he suffered his own ankle injury that sidelined him for a couple of weeks. Then by the time he was ready to come back, the Falcons had a lot more confidence in their young nickel cornerbacks with Richie Grant, Darren Hall. And so Hawkins' playing time was dialed back. Then in week 14, Hawkins got substantially more playing time due to the season-ending injury to Eric Harris, and he was basically thrust into the starting lineup for 3 games as Harris's replacement in the starting lineup. And I said this much at the time, and then after the season, I wasn't that impressed with Hawkins during that 3-game stretch. It felt like there were a lot of mental errors that he made through that stretch, and that's in contrast to Eric Harris, who I felt like didn't make that many mental errors over the course of the season. Like most of Harris's issues were, physical, as opposed to like missing tackles or dropping interceptions or whatever the case may be, than being in the wrong place at the wrong time or whatever the case may be. And so essentially, then after that 3 game sort of audition, Hawkins' season kind of ended prematurely because I think he was dealing with COVID at the time. And then we saw Sean Williams get thrust in the lineup. And frankly, I thought Sean Williams was better than Hawkins was in the 2 games that he was basically that, strong safety, whatever you want to call it, over Hawkins. And so, we had this 3 game sample of Hawkins as a starter, and it wasn't a great sample. It wasn't terrible by any means, but it goes back to the point I made earlier where it felt like the floor was kind of low in terms of what we're building off of based off of that 3 game sample from a year ago. And so, people were obviously very excited about what Hawkins can do with extended reps, particularly earlier in the season during that 4 game stretch where he was getting a lot of those sort of big nickel reps, playing a lot more deep safety than necessarily playing in a nickel. But you know, that gets me back to an aside that I'll just a slight tangent that I'll go on because like it was weird for me to see fans being so being like, "Oh, we got to play Jaylinn Hawkins a lot more," and I get it because like no one, no one wanted to see Eric Harris and Deron Harmon. We had gotten our kind of our fill of those guys after basically the first month of the season, and so it's like, oh, this defense will be so much better if Jaylinn Hawkins is a full time starter. We didn't really see that again later in the season, but it just gets to a point, and this is where I'm going to be a little bit of a film snob, as I often am on this podcast. But like, I sit here like I will be very judgmental on what the Falcons do essentially on Sundays watching the film. Like I feel like I can sit there and judge who's good, who's not, who's making plays, who's not, etc. As good as coaches. But it's always baffling to me when I see fans that kind of are much more opinionated about the Monday through Saturday stuff, so to speak. Like who's playing, who's part of the game plan and that sort of thing. It's always baffling to me. And like one of the things I strive to do here on this podcast, because of that sort of Sunday knowledge, is I try to, inform the listeners to make them more informed so that they can feel more confident that they can sit down and watch a game on Sunday and be able to tell those things. But when I see fans, just being like, oh, we should, if Jaylinn Hawkins, I think he was getting like 65% of the snaps during that 4 game stretch in the middle of the season. And it's like, if he gets 15 more snaps or 20 more snaps or whatever the case may be, like, is that going to suddenly fix the defense? Like, I don't get why fans think that, but I'll leave that tangent aside for now. And let's just get back to the conversation at hand, where the hope is with Jaylinn Hawkins that with another year under his belt, with a better understanding of the scheme, and what it wants at that position, he'll be able to better eliminate those mental errors that we saw plague him late in the season. And then he can be more of that playmaker that we saw during that stretch of games when the Falcons were playing a lot more big nickel, where he had some key interceptions in that Jets game and in that Dolphins game that really helped, sort of swing the momentum of those games. That the Jets game, I know, was his highest graded PFF graded game, and also, one of the better games I saw from him on film. And hopefully we can see more of those performances this year. But my hope is that we can get a little bit more consistency from him from the mental standpoint and eliminate some of those, down plays. But he also possesses that versatility that he can play in a box, he can play deep, he can do a lot of the same things that Eric Harris did a year ago. Hopefully, we won't have to see him play too much in the slot like we saw from Eric Harris for a couple of those games there, just due to having Isaiah Oliver back and feeling like we have some better options than that. But I certainly think because of those reasons, because he presents some of the same strengths that Harris presents in terms of the versatility, we just need to get a little bit more consistency. But there's certainly room for him to be an upgrade over what Eric Harris was a year ago. And so if Eric Harris is giving you league average play, which is like a 5 out of 10, then Jaylinn Hawkins, I think, is certainly capable of giving you above average play, which is potentially a 6 out of 10 this upcoming season. So we'll just stay tuned to that. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the player that arguably has the higher ceiling to be even better than that in Richie Grant as we continue and wrap up today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you can find 3 different shows daily devoted to Atlanta sports as well as national sports. You got Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste, and A to Z with Mark Zeno. Get those three shows, four different perspectives on all things Atlanta as well as national sports. And of course, you can find them all on your preferred podcast platform, whatever you're checking out Locked On Falcons currently. Locked On Sports Atlanta is free and available on that same podcast platform. And if you check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you'll also be able to check out the Locked On Braves postcast, where Locked On Braves is breaking down every win, every loss for the Atlanta Braves this season goes. So go find it all on your preferred podcast platform. And guys, I want to tell you about betonline.net, the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info, whether you're looking for odds, contests, player props. BetOnline has it all. This time of year is great to go check out betonline.net if you haven't already. You got the U.S. Open in golf this week. You got Stanley Cup Finals kicking off later this summer. You got Wimbledon, but you also got NBA Finals ongoing, Major League Baseball. If you want to check out other sports like boxing, esports, and Vegas casino games, you can find that at BetOnline. And of course, for those of you that are football junkies, you can find that USFL going on right now, as well as you can, do some future prop bets for the NFL this upcoming season. Offensive Rookie of the Year, you think Desmond Ridder or Drake London can run away with it? Coach of the Year, Arthur Smith, he's he's tied with Matt Rule for the worst odds in the league, and you're sitting here going like, how dare the bookies at BetOnline, put those odds that low? I'll take a flyer on a 50-1 shot that Arthur Smith wins Coach of the Year. Marcus Mariota being Comeback Player of the Year. You can find it all at betonline.net. BetOnline is where the game starts. So when we talk about Richie Grant, and some of this I talked about going back to February, right after the Super Bowl, where I was in the midst of my year-end positional reviews when we did the safety stuff. And so I always recommend going back and checking out those episodes. Especially now this time of year, and I certainly will be going back and listening to more of those episodes to sort of figure out what did I say, what did I think back in January as we get later this month when we start doing some training camp previews and going through each position group then. But it's a good practice, I think, to avoid drift when it comes to some of these off-season takes, because oftentimes we find ourselves convincing ourselves of brand new narratives, and not understanding, okay, like what did we actually think at the end of last season, and are now our expectations like wildly different from where they were 4 or so months ago. But what I said back then was I'm not too worried about Richie Grant, and Richie Grant is perfect for this conversation about sort of this Monday through Saturday scouting stuff, because a lot of people were miffed, I guess is the best word, or I don't know what, consternated. I don't know if that's the right word, but frustrated is probably the right word. Stop trying to use big words, Aaron. Just use the regular words that everybody understands. But I think a lot of people were frustrated with Richie Grant and sort of his lack of opportunities at safety last year, as well as maybe not getting him enough run at the nickel cornerback spot when he was arguably the best of that group. And what I said back in February was like, I get why people were frustrated with that, because Richie Grant, by all accounts, mine own included, had a disappointing rookie year, that the expectations for him going into last year were much higher than what he delivered on. But I don't think that should lead to people maybe, calling him a bust or being like, oh no, he's not going to be good, or whatever the case may be. And as I reminded folks in that episode back in February, like you look at previous Falcon safeties like Willie Moe, Thomas Deku, and Ricardo Allen, like those guys barely played as rookies and then went on to be very successful here in Atlanta over the next couple of years. And so the idea that Richie Grant is somehow doomed to not be an effective starter safety because his rookie season didn't go the way that I think a lot of us hoped it would, I think is pretty silly. So my main concern watching the games on Sunday with Richie Grant was mostly like, his tackling was a little shoddy, a little inconsistent. That was an issue, for him at UCF. But, just improving there, I think will certainly allow him to fix the flaws in some of his games. But I also kind of wonder, like, how big an issue is his tackling going to be? Because I don't think he's going to be playing as close to the line of scrimmage this year as he did a year ago when he was primarily that nickel cornerback, and expected to really fill in against the run, because I kind of expecting him to take over Duron Harmon's role as more of that deep safety in this defense. And we saw Harmon last year spend about 75% of his snaps, according to PFF, lined up, in the deeper part of the field, whether that was playing the deep half of the field in their cover two, or the deep middle in their sort of middle of the field closed coverages like cover one and cover three. And we know, we've talked about this going back to like February and whatnot. And we talked about how Dean Pease wants to play this defense, and he wants to use a lot more cover two, right? In the first 7 games of the season, the Falcons basically called some variation of cover two on like 50% of their coverage snaps. Now we know that Dean Pease likes to disguise his coverages, so it's as simple as just basically having those guys park, back there as split safeties and try to make plays. So he'll mix things up, having cornerbacks using some of these inverted coverages and all these various things. But primarily, you're going to see a lot of Hawkins and Grant probably playing a lot of split safety on roughly half of their coverage snaps this year. But then for the other remainder, when they're covering, playing those middle of the field close coverages, potentially man coverage for like 25 to 30% of the snaps, you may see a lot of Richie Grant there. Although it wouldn't shock me if you see a little bit more of Jaylinn Hawkins there, just because, because of Grant's experience playing nickel this past year, maybe they trust him a little bit more in man coverage. Jaylinn Hawkins did some nice things in limited opportunities in man coverage early in the season, especially against tight ends. So I think, it's going to depend heavily on how, Dean Pease draws up the game plan, what the opponent is. If they have a tight end, I think you're probably going to look to see maybe put Jaylinn Hawkins on that guy a little bit more than Richie Grant, just because of the size disparity between those two options. But they give you these flexibility, both Grant and Hawkins, to sort of mix and match. And we know that Dean Pease loves to keep you guessing when it comes to that stuff. And so I think Grant and Hawkins sort of really embody that. But getting back to Richie Grant sort of being that single high safety or playing more deep, if you go back to my scouting report of Richie Grant last year, I didn't think he would be like elite. And when it came to being that post safety or that single high safety or that center fielder, whatever you want to call it, I think a lot of people are looking for the next Earl Thomas or the next Justin Simmons. And I talked about those two guys in that episode. Richie Grant's not going to be that guy, but I certainly think he's more than capable of being on a level, at or above Ricardo Allen's level in that regard. May not be a guy that's making a ton of plays like people hope for, the Earl Thomases of the world or even the DeMonte Caseys of the world, but a guy that can go out there and do his job. And hopefully that leads to Grant being an upgrade over Duron Harmon. We talked about Harris being a 5 out of 10 last year. Well, Harmon, based off of that on scale, couldn't be higher than a 4 out of 10 last year. And so I'm hoping that Grant could be at least a 5 out of 10 this year. But I think he has, in terms of long-term potential, he has more of that to be greater than that than maybe a guy like Hawkins. Now, I will say for Jaylinn Hawkins, he's already outperformed my original draft expectations for him from 2 years ago. My ceiling comparison for him was Matthias Farley, who was a quality backup for the Colts for several years in the past. And Farley was probably closer to a 4 out of 10 player. And I already kind of expect Hawkins to be in that 5 to 6 range this upcoming season. So like I said, already has sort of outperformed those expectations. But my ceiling comparison for Richie Grant a year ago was Rodney McLeod, who was probably, a 7 out of 10 player and probably had a couple of years sprinkled in there where he might have been an 8 out of 10, but over the life of his career, for the most part, with the Rams and Eagles, was probably a 7 out of 10. And again, I think that's leads me to believing that Richie Grant has the greater potential of the two guys, just because I think he can do a little bit more on the deep end, even if that's not necessarily where his bread is going to be butter or where he'll be elite at. But when I look at these two players and their potential, like I'm not expecting them to reach their peaks and their ceilings this upcoming season, right? Like I feel like both guys are kind of starting out at 4s, right? Hawkins, based off of that 3-game sample last year, where I think I would have probably said he was a 4 out of 10 as a starter replacing Eric Harris and Richie Grant in a similar boat. And so I'm expecting them to be better than that this season, but I'm expecting some ups and downs that come with young safeties, right? But we're hoping that the flashes will be enough to sort of carry the day. And so for me, when that's why I'm sitting here going like, I think they can be fives. I don't know if they'll be more than that because generally speaking, when I'm looking at like guys that are 6 out of 10s, I tend to value consistency a little bit more than maybe some other people's do. But Deion Jones, for a lot of his career was a 6, but he wasn't necessarily consistent. He was like some weeks he was a 4, some weeks an 8, and it balanced out to be a 6. And in a lot of cases, sometimes Deion was like a 2, and some weeks he was a 10, and that balanced out to be a 6. But I think consistency is going to be the main thing for both of these young safeties. I think we have a tendency, particularly at this position, because so much of what you're watching on Sundays, you don't really see what the safeties are doing watching on television. You really kind of have to see the all 22 to see that. And so there is a tendency among fans to fall in love with playmakers. And that's why so many people were not necessarily huge fans of Ricardo Allen, but, were bigger fans of DeMonte Casey during his days. But, Allen, like Harris, and we'll see how, Grant and Hawkins fit on this paradigm, but, was much more a consistent, do your job type of player for the most part here in Atlanta. But that stuff gets missed, right? And so I think for these two young safeties and Hawkins and Grant, you're hoping that they can do their jobs a little bit better, eliminate some of the mental errors, the missed tackles, the blown coverages, some of the things that plagued them at times last year. And once you can comfortably do your job, know what's expected from you out of the defense, that's to me is where the plays can start to happen rather than just, kind of being DeMonte Casey. And we're not going to go into a deep DeMonte Casey deep dive on today's episode, but kind of being out of position, but somehow managing to turn that into, being in the right place, or he was basically in the wrong place at the right time, I guess you could say, is the best way of describing how DeMonte Casey led to all those turnovers just being late on plays or whatever the case may be. But again, we're not going to get into that on today's episode. So I feel like, again, Dean Pease is more about, everybody out there doing their job, all 11 guys doing their job. And as long as you do that, we're going to be just fine. And I think Grant and Hawkins have that capability. We just haven't seen it yet from these two guys. And I'm hoping that we will see that like that. But because of that reason, like in all these things that we talked about on today, like I feel like our safety duo is going to be fine this season. I'm excited to see what they can become. What floor of the building are we going to be at by the end of the season? 15th, 20, 25th, whatever. But you're not going to see me hyping up this safety duo to the same degree that you may see from other folks this summer. So we're just in wait and see mode to see what these guys can do. I like the cornerback room. I think there's a little bit more question marks with this safety group. And I'm sure we'll have some more comments when we get to the training camp previews. And, now that I've already sort of expended all my takes on Richie Grant and Jaylinn Hawkins, I guess we'll have to spend that episode devoted primarily to Dean Marlowe and Tease Tabor or whoever else that we're going to be talking about, Brad Hawkins, I guess, on that episode. So look forward to that later this summer. But that will do it for us here, guys. And the good thing is that the Falcons have money, right? And even if these guys don't live up to these expectations, they can always just go out there and spend big money on Amani Hooker or, Adrian Amos or Eddie Jackson or whoever, whatever former Bear that Ryan Pace will convince Terry Fontenot to sign next offseason. So we'll see how it all plays out, but excited to see what these guys can do, but not necessarily going to spend my summer hyping them up to be like, oh, these guys can be superstars and they're going to help the Falcons secondary be one of the best in the league. Cornerback room, like safety group, still a question mark, but we'll see how these guys roll this upcoming season. Certainly have the capacity to fit well in this defense. But guys, that's where we'll leave it. And tomorrow, I don't know what we'll do. I guess we'll do, maybe a Q&A or whatever the case may be. So send in your questions to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can also, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, email me at I'm sorry, I'm confused. Email me at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can also hit me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel if you have any comments on today's episode, future episodes, or past episodes. Of course, I'm all ears for all that feedback. Later this week, we should have some guests, and then we'll be able to do the Tyler Algier scouting report hopefully by the end of the week. And also hopefully we'll get you guys covered as mandatory mini camp opens up on Cordero Patterson shows up, and finally, like, all the pieces, all the Voltron forces assembled now. The Falcons, just running their 7-on-7 stuff at mandatory minicamp, and now all of a sudden it's just everything's going to start clicking for this team, and they're just going to be off to the races. Again, it's off season. I'm following Arthur Smith's plan of just kind of downplaying all this mini camp and OTA stuff until we get to training camp and whatnot. But we'll see what develops at mandatory mini camp and whatnot. So, guys, that will do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. As your second listen after you've made Locked On Falcons your first listen, which we always thank you for, go check out Locked On NFL to stay abreast of what's going on with the other 31 NFL teams. Of course, Locked On NFL has you covered on all the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. Appreciate it, guys. Till then.